Hello, welcome to True Hoop with me, Jarod Hector, and I have a special guest with me. He is the founder and director of the Boston University Center for Antiracist Research. He is the author of several books, including the New York Times bestseller, How to Be an Anti-Racist, and Stamped from the Beginning, The Definitive History of Racist Ideas in America, which won the National Book Award for Nonfiction in 2016. He's also the host and executive producer of the ESPN Plus series, Skin in the Game, which looks at racism in sports and where and how to challenge it. Professor Ibram X. Kendi, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
No problem. All right. So I want to get into this right away off the top. The Center for Anti-Racist Research at BU and you have been in the news a lot lately for allegations from ex-staffers, critics, etc., for this audacious, this tremendous project of using anti-racist research to really combat one of the ills that faces our time, and recent layoffs of staff and research that you and the center said that these were plans of yours that have not come to pass amidst $55 million in money raised or questions of financial impropriety. I do want to say BU did look into this, and of the 55 million raised, BU said that the majority of the money is still sitting unspent in BU account. So there is no impropriety on that standpoint. But if you can just talk to us about what actually happened when you started this center, and with the layoffs and the research that was supposed to come to fruition that hasn't thus far, like the graduate program in anti-racist research and the national racial data tracker.
Well, I think first and foremost, I think it's important to contextualize why we're even having this conversation. Um, Unfortunately, over the last 3 years, but especially over the last year, there's been a number of organizations, particularly nonprofits, that have had to engage in major pivots, that have had to engage in major layoffs. And part of that reason is because there's been a pretty significant decline in the amount of money that our organizations are raising. But most of those stories have been one-day stories. In most cases, people recognize this larger climate that we're facing, this financial climate, and understood that if an organization needs to be financially sustainable, it has to sort of pivot and potentially, and of course in a difficult way, reduce staff. Unfortunately, with our center, the story has been different. People assumed financial impropriety, which is not true. People have assumed that media, I should say reporters, have given voice to people who were upset about being laid off, or about the layoffs. And I think you can imagine that in any organization, if you give a microphone to somebody who has just been laid off, they're probably not going to have nice things to say about the person who did that layoff, or even about the organization. And so I think that that's probably one of the most tragic aspects of this, that what's happened at the center is quite normal in this specific environment in which so many organizations are having to reduce staff and restructure themselves. But we're a Black-led organization. We're an organization engaged in anti-racist research. We're led by a public figure. That's what people call me. And so the level of scrutiny, and it's just much higher for our organization, unfortunately.
And I appreciate that. Thank you. I would guess if you were to go back to 6-7 years ago, you probably didn't envision this as something that would happen. This being a major university giving you the platform to be the head of a Center for Anti-Racist Research, and also to be a National Book Award winner, and also to be a public figure, as you said, has been named a MacArthur Fellow, like all of these things, right? So there's a level of sort of, even in the most positive thinking people, right? Like, I don't know that most people envision, like, wow, like getting to the top, maybe faster than they thought, or this amazing things happening. So all of that's happening to you, right? All at the same time, where I believe you genuinely want to promote anti-racism and stamp out racism worldwide, but particularly here in the US. So what would you say to people who are like, I agree with his vision for anti-racism, but maybe he isn't the right person to lead this because it's a tremendous undertaking looking at research, policy, narrative, advocacy, and maybe he just didn't have the experience to do all of this.
Well, it's interesting that we're we're talking about this, particularly within the context of basketball or even
Hmm. Hmm.
sports,
Hmm.
because as you know, there are rookies or first or second year ballers who come into the NBA without much experience, and they win championships, or they make it to the NBA championship, and they don't necessarily win the championship, but they learn a tremendous amount as they go through that process, and they of course transform that learning into being better ballers, into being better leaders, and and so I think unfortunately, I and other leaders aren't necessarily looked upon in the same way.
Hmm.
In other words, we're not necessarily given the opportunity to not win the championship, uh, to have to make major changes in our jump shot, to have to make major changes in how we play the game, and how to make major changes in sort of how we relate to people so that we can win. And so I think certainly it has been the case um, that there, I could understand someone saying that only someone with 50 years or 20 years or 5 years of experience should be leading a major American research center. But then the net effect of that is that likely only old white men will be leading these types of centers. Because the fact of the matter is that people of color and women have been shut out of these centers for a very long time, shut out of leadership positions. We're learning on the fly, and that's precisely what I'm doing. And our center will be so much stronger and so much better and so much impactful, as our I and my sort of leadership staff continue to learn and change and grow. And we're so excited about this new pivot and this new structure, just as we're obviously extremely devastated that we had to let people go.
Yeah, and the last thing before we move on to the Skin in the Game series, you mentioned the pivot. The center has pivoted to a fellowship model, as opposed to what you were doing before. What would you say is the biggest lesson you learned in these 3 years here, and that you're going to now take and apply to what you're going to do differently going forward?
Well, the irony, about a lot of the attacks or even criticism on our center is that the vast majority of the challenges that we face, that even people have pointed out, are going to be uh, corrected in the new model, right? And so,
Mhm.
and I think again, like I think that to me this is part of a larger challenge, which is that the job of it's very 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 hard for any creator of a startup to create a structure, and that structure be the structure that lives forever.
Mhm. Mhm.
With
Mhm.
that organization, it's routine that at some point, particularly for organizations um, that carry on and that make an impact, that there's a major pivot, and that major pivot is one in which um, the challenges that an organization faced are not brought into sort of a new organization, and so that's really what we're doing here. Like many other organizations that are praised for these types of pivots, while we're criticized. But to your answer, I think one there are many things that I learned, and as a scholar, even as someone who strives to be anti-racist, I'm constantly encouraging people to be self-reflective and to be self-critical. But probably the biggest learning, that I had, you know, is is that it is incredibly important to create a a sustainable model and look consistently and constantly 20 and 30 years out, just as you're looking at the next 2 years.
Mhm.
And so with this new fellowship program that we're building, it allows us to accommodate massive swings in fundraising. So what we've experienced over the last 3 years, where there's been a decline, that could increase, right? And or it could decline again. And we have a enough endowment funding that we can have a baseline number of fellows, so that if we have a down sort of fundraising year,
Mhm.
it doesn't cause us to have to lay people off, right?
Mhm.
Just as we
Mhm.
have a great year, we can increase the number of fellows.
Mhm.
And so for us, just thinking about and learning about the financial landscape for racial justice organizations, and that 2020 in many ways was a um, what was really outside of the norm. Unfortunately, I think has been something that we've really learned in the last 3 years. We hope that 2020 was the start of something new, but unfortunately, it wasn't.
I appreciate that, and thank you for addressing that. I want to pivot to the series, Skin in the Game. In the opening, credit roll, you say, "At the end of the day, I'm just a kid from Queens who loves sports and confronts racism." What is it about sports that makes it a fertile ground for your work, and what do you hope? Or what did you hope this series would do as it relates to promoting anti-racist thoughts?
Well, I think one of the interventions that I've sought to make with my work has not only been to define terms for people so they can understand what it means to be racist or even anti-racist, what is a racist or anti-racist idea or policy, but so that they can use that terminology and those definitions to see inequality, to see racism in places that were unsuspecting, that they didn't see it before. And obviously, some people view sports as a sort of a place or a space where we can quote get away from social
Mm,
injustice,
mm,
as opposed to a place where unfortunately racial injustice and racism is pervasive. And and I think what I'm hoping though is that despite the pervasiveness of racism, that through skin in the game, people will see not only how it's operating, but how athletes are resisting it and how they're almost trying and winning in many cases this game, or even losing this game within the game
mhm,
as
mhm,
they're playing, the game that we can see,
mhm.
which can hopefully allow us to appreciate these human beings that much more. Like they're fighting or battling so many different games at the same time.
Yeah, no, I'm with you on that, and I think that seeing the humanity in athletes is one of the things that we and I do primarily a lot here at True Hoop. Is yes, I understand that for fans, they want enjoyment and entertainment, right? Whatever's going on in their life for the 2 hours that I turn on this game, whatever sport it may be, I just want to be entertained. I don't want to be, because whatever's going on in my life is hard enough. I don't want to hear about your life on top of that too. Just do some cool things, and great, 2 hours will be done. Um, and while I don't agree with that, I understand that inclining, right? If because life is hard. Um, However, athletes have a power and influence, and often power and influence are things that we in society conflate, and they're not quite the same thing, right? But they're often lumped in together. How do you see athletes and their power and influence, and how should they be using it?
I'm actually happy you mentioned that we should distinguish between power and influence, and I think that most athletes are in very important positions of influence, but they aren't necessarily in positions of power. And if we understand power, particularly the most ultimate form of power is the ability to make policy or to change policy that impacts the lives of of human beings, then certainly athletes have the power through their players associations to change policy as it relates to their leagues,
Hmm.
right, and to
Hmm.
their games. But they don't necessarily have the power to change policy as it relates to employees at a corporation or citizens of a particular um, town, or state. However, they do have the influence to inspire those employees or those citizens to demand of those in policy making positions to create more equitable and just policies. And I think many athletes are using that influence. And in what's interesting is, without question, many of us tune in to sports to be entertained, but I also think that there are many people who tune into sports to be inspired. And that even that inspiration and entertainment can be intertwined. Wow, they just did something that's
Hmm.
impossible
Hmm.
on the court.
Hmm.
Maybe I can do something that's impossible in my job, right?
Hmm.
But then, inspire, again, us to, organize against police violence. Athletes have that level of influence.
Yeah. And the NBA of many leagues is one of the ones that are at the forefront of it, even though we here at True Hoop, because as our name implies, we seek the truth, right? The NBA has its own issues in terms of, I often say that the NBA gets credit a lot of times for not being the NFL, right? But I'm like, that's a low bar to jump over,
Yes.
right? I mean, so when you talk about what athletes can do from an influential and power standpoint, they sort of they have conflict, right? Because there's a point in which when you get to be super successful as an athlete, the money that you make starts to separate you and insulate you from the day-to-day concerns that many people have. Now, it doesn't mean that you can't be a person who's black and has a net worth of $50 million and you won't get stopped and harassed by the police. There's plenty of examples of that. But the day-to-day, right, experiences of, you know, the person working 3 jobs to just maintain rent, like that is long since left your consciousness, right? And so it creates this challenge, I feel like, in many times for athletes to really understand, okay, I can do these things because I have this power and this influence, excuse me. But maybe I have to be careful, because if I rock the boat too much, that's going to mess the dollars up. And if I mess the dollars up, then I've got problems, right? So there's almost a little bit of a chain reaction, right? Because it's like someone else controls my purse strings, and so I have to be careful about what I say and do if I want to keep these funds rolling in.
Indeed, and I think that concern that uh, athletes have is, I think, a concern that's shared by many, black and brown folks, of wealth, and who are higher income. But what I think is important for those black athletes to just know scientifically is, and historically, is that the people who were most likely to be lynched were actually landowners, were black folks who owned
Mm-hmm.
extremely successful businesses,
Mm-hmm.
were black folks who were upwardly mobile, um, and who uh, had a tremendous amount of either economic or political resources. And studies have shown that as Black Americans climb the economic ladder, uh, they're actually more likely to face racist policies and
Mm-hmm.
practices. And so that's the irony, right? You have rich athletes who don't want to confront racism because they think that somehow they've escaped it, when in reality, they're facing forms of racism um, that is actually quite dire, as those with tremendous amounts of wealth try to keep their wealth and try
Mhm.
to prevent Black people from climbing up that ladder. And so in many ways they're undermining even their own economic
Mhm.
aspirations by
Mhm.
not joining this larger fight against racism. So I think it's important for athletes to think about not just their own individual situation, but the larger structure that's inhibiting them. And what I mean by that is, if an athlete is making a few $1 million a year, then in a potentially different type of society where racism doesn't exist, they could be making more. Like
Mhm.
that's what,
Mhm. Mhm.
and I'm saying, clearly I think the more progressive thing to do is to say, oh, it's important for athletes to care about working class Black folks,
Mhm.
to be altruistic. But I guess for me, I believe that people are more uh, sort of motivated by their own self interest,
Self-interest.
and it's in the self interest of rich athletes to fight racism.
No, that makes sense. A lot of what you're talking about echoes a little bit of, I'm sure you're familiar with it. The legendary New York Times, former New York Times writer, sports columnist Bill Rhoden's $40 million slaves, right? This idea of being confined, even though $40 million sounds like a ton of money, which it is, right? In actuality, but you are still sort of limited, right? Within that box. To your point, if this was a anti-racist society, you would be making way more, but that's not the reality that we're in. I kind of want to pivot off that. Do you
Can I
think?
just
Yeah, go ahead.
mention a real quick thing? I remember just very quickly when there was the last strike in the NBA,
Hmm.
and I remember when some of the athletes started thinking about or talking about creating, like they were already sort of creating games
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
organizing
Hmm.
games, and there was talk about the athletes themselves creating their own league.
I was just going there. I'm glad you brought that up.
And the reason why I'm bringing that up, I'm happy you were going there, is because that uh, I remember there were very prominent commentators who opposed those ideas with racist ideas. They were like, these Black athletes can't
Right.
own a team, can't
Hmm.
develop a league,
Hmm.
can't run
Hmm.
a league, can't sort of run a business. Um, and in reality, why can't they not? I mean, we have so many athletes who literally, like Jay-Z said, I'm a business
Hmm.
man.
Hmm. Hmm. They are the attraction, right? That is what you turn on your television, you pull up your phone, or you paid money to go see. That's what you go to see. You don't go to see the dude who owns the arena, or that's most people don't even know who that is, or to pick that person out of a lineup. That would be the way to do it, and it would obviously take. Let's use the NBA as an example. It would take LeBron and KD and Steph and the top guys, because whatever NBA players want to tell you, those are the guys that decide what everybody else is doing. If they're all on board and doing it, everybody, the rank and file will all say, okay, this is what we're doing. Could they do a thing where they say, because what they do right now is supplement these owners who own these arenas, right? And fill it with dates for games. Well, forget you guys. We're going to get a soundstage somewhere in wherever, build them in places all across the country. We're going to own it, right? We're going to have people that we hire. Here's our investment in the teams. That would be a very profitable league. Um, whether or not it happens, and it's again, when you get to a level like LeBron and Steph and KD, it's like you know, uh,
Yeah.
it's a lot for them to take on.
Well, and it's almost like the conundrum that just you have executives at uh, companies who are very highly paid, but at the same time, they're looking at the balance sheets and stating that if they were to start their own business, they could the sort of upside is so much greater than their current salary. However, they're like, it's a tremendous risk,
Yes.
right? And so
Mhm.
it's this sort of conundrum: do I stay in this sort of executive position, uh, where I'm sort of where I will receive this salary if
Mhm.
if you're sort of a max player in the
Mhm.
NBA,
Mhm.
like that's going to happen. It's guaranteed. I already have my contract. Um, or do I move to create a new business where I could potentially make more, but I could also make less?
Correct. Correct.
And I suspect that's what these athletes are thinking, just as regular folks are thinking that as they work for companies as opposed to building their own.
No, yeah, and I think that's exactly dead on. In one of the episodes of Skin in the Game, you looked at the media landscape and how in sports that are predominantly people of color, the newsrooms in sports are predominantly white and male, and that is often not the lens that these sports should be covered through. And what we've seen as a result of that are a lot of athletes that have their own platforms, whether it be podcasts, whether they write and they do their different things. And you were a champion and encourage that more athletes should do that. And as someone in the media, but as someone who's Black, I push back at that notion. I like the idea that they say things like that because it's great. And there's a way in which when athletes talk to one another, if I don't have that built in trust with that athlete already, I'm not going to get the same response. But even if I do, there is a level of peer-to-peer connection they have that we as reporters will never have and media members will never have. However, in my opinion, athlete-led media is just another form of propaganda because right, they're not going to get into the real nitty-gritty of what is really happening. And so I kind of want to explore that with you. Like where can there be some kind of synergy or symbiosis between actual media and athlete-led media?
So I think that there could be, and I think that the irony is that as athletes continue to create their own media platforms and pull viewers and readers away from quote traditional sort of sports media, it's at some point, if it hasn't already, going to create a crisis because sports media is just does not have the viewers and the attention that it once did. And then of course the athlete-led media is looking for legitimacy, right? So it isn't just viewed by the public as as mere propaganda.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess what I'm hoping is that at some point both sides will realize that a potential uh, connection or fusion or
Mm-hmm.
symbiosis
Mm-hmm.
is actually better for both. I think the challenge though is a lack of trust,
Yeah.
the lack of trust between, let's say, the Black athlete and the white reporter, which then where does the Black reporter sit?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
They're almost in the crossfire,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
so to speak. And so in many ways, it will likely be Black and brown reporters who broker that relationship. And I think that's sort of on individual levels, is happening.
No, absolutely, 100%. All right, so you are a kid from Queens, which means you're a sports fan. So I assume you're a Knicks fan coming from New York City. How
Yeah.
how are you feeling about your? Listen, this is good stuff, man. The Knicks have been competently run now for the last, I don't know, ever since Leon got there. They've been run well. You made the playoffs last season, won a playoff series. I mean, things are trending up. How are you feeling as a Knicks fan?
So I'm feeling good. Obviously, I'm to have a team that I think most people are recognizing is a second sort of tier team in the Eastern Conference. There are some who believe because of all of the player changes with some of the top teams that
Mm-hmm.
a team with more consistency,
Mm-hmm.
who hasn't sort of changed over that much, could sort of make noise in the Eastern Conference. So of course, as Knicks fans, we believe the impossible. Um, but on the other hand, having such a great team last year, and then Julius Randle getting injured, it sort of felt yet again a situation in which something has to happen. You know, whether Julius Randle getting injured or Charlie Ward being body slammed, just derails you know, what we have been hoping for. So hopefully this year there won't be anything like that, and we can show how truly good we could be.
The Knicks are a very good squad. I think like Jalen Brunson was an excellent signing for you guys. Again, I think the team is being run and managed well. You don't have any bad contracts. You've got draft capital. Look, you guys can be players and make a potential trade for someone to pair, and kind of move this thing forward. But I think, Knicks fans need to live in the land of keep optimism there, but also live in the land of reality. And just
Hard for us.
yeah, it's very hard for you guys. And just hey, make the playoffs consistently year over year, and in those magical years, you get lucky and you go on a run. That's it. If you think about it, if you guys have that, it's better than what you've done the last 20 years. Way better.
See, it's hard to live in the land of reality when most Knicks fans have never tasted a championship.
It's true.
In my whole life, and most Knicks fans who were fans in the '90s felt we were cheated away, from a few titles. So it's just hard. There's so much resentment there.
I mean, if your man Jock Starks hits one more three, you guys win the title. I mean, come on. There's just things happen, right? It's basketball,
Exactly. So, but I am excited about this team. I don't, um, and it's going to be very interesting to see what they do this year. And I think the other thing is the team is like, it looks like Tibbs is going to go with a 9-man rotation, and those are 9 really good players.
Yeah.
It's a really deep squad. I was looking at the ESPN just released I think they're down to the top 100 players. The Knicks had 5 players. I believe. And which to me is a large number for one team.
Listen, again, things are looking good. You're an above average squad. You're run competently. Like, let's just maintain even keel. It's hard, I know, because you want to win a championship so bad. But I mean, think about it. In the history of the NBA, like the Lakers and Celtics have like the majority of championships. The teams don't win that often. It's just hard, right? It's really hard to do it. Very, very hard. But Professor Kendi, I thank you for your time.
Taking his talents to Manhattan.
If LeBron took his talents, if KD and Kyrie came, listen, it just doesn't work out like that sometimes. But I appreciate your time. Let the people know where they can find you, and also what to look out for next from the BU Center for Antiracist Research.
So everyone can find me at IbramXKendi.com, and my handles are Ibram XK, IBRAM XK. And with our center, we're actually going to be launching our racial data tracker, in the next few weeks. So I'm really excited about that.
Excellent. And I thank you for your time, sir.
All right. Thank you for having me.